The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which seemed wrong, somehow. Bad news ought to come on a Monday, she had always thought. Mondays were already ruined. Harriet? No. The solicitor had called her Miss Weston. Miss Imogen Weston, daughter of the late Sir Reginald Weston of Ashgrove Park, Somerset. He had said it with a particular flatness, the way men say names they no longer consider important. She had stood in the corridor outside his office for a long time after, the letter folded in her hand, the wax seal already broken. She could hear the street traffic below. Somewhere a horse was being shod. Life continuing, indifferent. Her father had been dead for 11 days. The will, the solicitor explained, was not what she had been led to expect. Ashgrove Park, the house she had been born in, the house where she had learned to read sitting on the window sill in the East Library, the house where her mother had died and where her father had aged badly and quietly. Ashgrove Park had passed. By means of an entailment Imogen had never been told existed, to a distant male relation, a cousin twice removed, a man she had met once at a funeral when she was 9 years old and who had looked at her the way people look at furniture they don't intend to buy. That much she might have borne. The entailment was old law, unjust law, but old. What she had not expected, what nothing could have prepared her for, was the second document. A deed of sale, dated 8 months prior, signed by her father while he was still living. He had sold her mother's jewelry, the Somerset land holdings, and the London house on Cavendish Street. Sold them quietly, without a word to her, to clear gambling debts she had not known existed. There was almost nothing left. She had walked home through the October rain and stood in the hallway of the rented rooms she could no longer afford, and looked at the water dripping from the brim of her hat onto the floor, and thought, with a strange, distant clarity, I have to go back. Ashgrove Park was hers. Not by law, not anymore, but in every way that mattered, she was going back. The problem was that the new master of Ashgrove Park was not the cousin. The cousin, it turned out, had held the estate for exactly 4 months before selling it, also to clear debts, which Imogen found almost funny, to a man named Calder Ashworth, the Duke of Ashworth. She had read about him in the papers once or twice, the way one reads about weather in countries one has never visited. He was not a social figure. He did not appear at the usual events. What was written about him tended toward the financial. He had interests in railway lines, in wool production, in a number of enterprises that Imogen had found dull even to skim. He owned property in Northumberland, in Scotland, and now, apparently, in Somerset. He was 36 years old. He had never married. The papers, when they mentioned this at all, did so in the tone of a puzzle that no one had yet thought to solve. Imogen thought about him for 2 days and then wrote to the estate agent who was managing the property transition and inquired about domestic positions. She did not give her full name. She gave her mother's maiden name, Hartfield, and listed her qualifications honestly, because she was, in fact, genuinely qualified. She could manage a household. She had been doing it since she was 17. She did not examine too closely what she intended to do once she was inside. The reply came within the week. The estate required a housekeeper. The previous one had left abruptly. The agent did not explain why. The position came with a small wage and rooms in the East Wing. The East Wing where the library was. She wrote back the same evening. She arrived in late October when the Somerset countryside had gone the color of rust, and the air smelled of wet leaves and approaching winter. The trap from the village let her down at the gate, and she walked the last quarter-mile herself, her trunk to be sent on after, her bag over her arm, her shoes already damp from the grass. Ashgrove Park looked smaller than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply grown. The stone was the same, pale bath stone that turned gold in afternoon light, and the cedar on the south lawn was the same, taller now, and the walled garden gate was still slightly crooked on its hinges, a fact she had reported to her father 3 separate times and which he had never addressed. She stopped at the cedar and put her hand against the bark. Then she walked on, because she had work to do. The housekeeper's entrance was on the north side, which she knew without being told, because she had spent her entire childhood being told to use it. She knocked. A young woman opened the door, round-faced, startled, wiping her hands on her apron. "Miss Hartfield?" "Yes," said Imogen. "I've just come from the village." Her name was Agnes, and she was the housemaid, and she talked without seeming to notice that she was doing it, which Imogen found useful. By the time she had been shown to her rooms, yes, the east wing, yes, the library was just down the passage, she had learned that the Duke had arrived 10 days ago, that he had brought his own secretary and his own valet but no one else, that he kept to himself almost entirely, that he ate at irregular hours, and that he had upset the cook twice already without, as far as Agnes could tell, meaning to. "He doesn't speak much," Agnes said, setting down Imogen's bag. "But it's not. He's not unkind. He just looks at things very carefully. It makes people nervous." Imogen looked at the room, at the familiar view through the window, the kitchen garden, the wall, the elm beyond it. She had looked at this view from the other side of that wall 1,000 times, as a child. From the outside, looking in. Now she was on the inside, looking out. But nothing felt like she had imagined it would. "Thank you, Agnes," she said. "I'll manage from here." She did not meet the Duke until her 3rd day. She had been carefully busy, taking inventory of the linen, conferring with the cook, reviewing the household accounts, which were in a state that suggested the previous housekeeper had left in some haste. She told herself she was biding her time. Mostly she was telling herself that. On the 3rd morning she was in the library. She had told herself she was cataloging. She had a notebook. She had, in fact, cataloged 11 volumes before she stopped, pretending, and simply sat in the window seat, where she had always sat, and looked at the gardens and tried to understand what she was doing here and what she expected to find. Her mother's books were still on the shelves. Her father had not sold them. She didn't know if that made it better or worse. She heard the door. "I wasn't aware this room was being used." She stood up quickly. The man in the doorway was tall, considerably taller than she had registered from the movement of him, with dark hair that needed cutting, and the look of someone who had been up since before dawn and had not thought much about it either way. He was in his shirt sleeves. He held a cup of coffee. He was looking at her the way Agnes had described, carefully, like a problem he was determining whether to solve. "I was taking inventory of the volumes," Imogen said, which was almost true. "I apologize for the intrusion, Your Grace. I'll continue another time." She moved toward the door. He didn't move out of the way, not exactly, but he shifted slightly, and she was aware, passing him, of how still he was. People who were very still in doorways were usually either very calm or very unhappy, in her experience. She was in the corridor when he said, "The inventory can wait." She turned. "I've been trying to find something," he said. "There was a letter, in the estate papers I received. It mentioned a record of the household's original contents. A ledger of some kind. I can't locate it." She knew exactly what he was talking about. Her mother had kept a household ledger, meticulous, beautiful, annotated in her small handwriting. It had sat in the library for as long as Imogen could remember, in the 3rd drawer of the writing desk. "I'll look into it," she said. "Thank you, Miss Hartfield." She walked down the corridor and did not look back. She found the ledger that afternoon, in the 3rd drawer of the writing desk, where it had always been. She sat with it in her lap for a long time. Her mother's handwriting, 1889, inventory of household contents, Ashgrove Park, Somerset. Each room listed, each item described, the blue vase from the upper hallway, the pair of ormolu clocks, her grandmother's embroidered fire screen, all of it written down in the quiet, careful hand of a woman who had believed that things ought to be recorded, that what you loved ought to be accounted for. She was going to hand this to the Duke of Ashworth. She thought about that for a while. Then she carried it upstairs. He was in the study, her father's study. She did not think of it as the study. She thought of it as her father's study, which was perhaps her first problem. He was at the desk. The secretary, a thin young man named Mr. Felton, was nearby, and both of them looked up when she knocked. She handed the ledger to the Duke. He opened it. "Read the first page. Then the second. This is detailed," he said. "The previous lady of the house was thorough," Imogen said. He looked up at her. She was not certain what he was looking for, but she held his gaze steadily, because she had spent her entire life being looked at by men who expected her to look away. "Do you know if all of these items are still on the property?" he asked. "I'll verify that," she said. "I can have a list for you by Friday. That would be useful," he said, and went back to reading. She left. The man arrived 3 weeks later. She didn't know him by sight, but she knew his type, the way she had learned to know it in her father's later years, when the wrong sort of men had started appearing at Ashgrove for dinner and staying too long and talking too quietly. Men who smiled with their mouths and calculated with their eyes. His name was Mr. Forsyth. He arrived without an appointment, asked for the Duke, and was put in the front sitting room while Agnes went upstairs. Imogen, passing through the hallway with the week's correspondence, paused. She should not have eavesdropped. She did it anyway. She couldn't hear much. The door was mostly closed, and Mr. Forsyth's voice was the kind that stayed low by habit. But she heard the Duke clearly, because when the Duke spoke in a certain register, his voice carried, "That matter is not open for discussion." And Mr. Forsyth, his daughter, and the Duke very quiet now. "I said it is not open." She moved away before she could hear more. But she stood in the corridor for a moment after, the correspondence in her hands, and something cold settled in her stomach. His daughter. She told herself it could mean anything. She had not been careful enough. She understood this when Mr. Felton came to find her in the East Wing, 3 days later, looking uncomfortable in the way that men look uncomfortable when they are doing something they have been asked to do and do not entirely approve of. "His Grace would like to see you," Mr. Felton said. In the study. The Duke was standing when she came in, which she noticed because he usually sat. He was holding a piece of paper. He looked at her for a long moment, and in that moment she understood, from the particular quality of the silence, that something had shifted. "I received a letter," he said, "from a solicitor in Bath. He writes on behalf of a Miss Imogen Weston, daughter of the late Sir Reginald Weston of Ashgrove Park." She said nothing. "He writes to inquire," the Duke continued, "whether I am aware that his client has taken a position in his household under a false name." The fire was the only sound in the room. "He advises me," the Duke said, "that if I wish to pursue a legal remedy, he stands ready to." "He's working for Forsyth," she said. The Duke stopped. "Mr. Forsyth," she said, and she was surprised by how steady her voice was. "The man who came 3 weeks ago, he's a creditor. One of my father's creditors, I imagine. He's been trying to establish a claim on anything that might remain. If he can demonstrate that I've committed fraud, deception, misrepresentation, whatever a solicitor wants to call it, he can pursue a civil case. It won't succeed, but it will take years, and in the meantime—" She stopped. "In the meantime, it costs money I don't have." The Duke looked at her. "You knew about Forsyth. I suspected. And yet you stayed." She looked at the window, the kitchen garden, the elm, the view she had grown up with from the wrong side. "This is my home," she said. "I grew up here. My mother died here. My father was buried 3 miles from here. I have nowhere else in the world that means anything to me, and I was not." Her voice was steady. She made certain of that. "I was not willing to simply walk away from it because the law said I should." The Duke set the letter down on the desk. She waited for him to dismiss her. She had her things mostly packed already. In truth, she had packed them last night, in the small hours, when she couldn't sleep and honesty was easier in the dark. "Sit down, Miss Weston," he said. She sat. He sat, too. He looked at the letter. Then he looked at her. "I purchased this property," he said, "in good faith, through the estate agent, from a man who had legal title to it. I am told I gave a fair price. I have been attempting since my arrival to understand what I have acquired and whether it is worth improving." She waited. "I do not want your home," he said. She heard the sentence. She heard it again. "I beg your pardon?" "I want land," he said, "because land in Somerset holds certain agricultural and commercial value that interested me. I want the house because it came with the land, but I have no particular attachment to this house. I have no history here." He paused. "You clearly do. That doesn't change the legal reality," she said, because she was a practical person and she had spent 11 days becoming more practical than she had ever thought she'd need to be. "No," he said, "but it changes other things." He was quiet for a moment. "Forsyth's claim is specious. You misrepresented your name, not your qualifications, and your work here has been competent. I will write to his solicitor accordingly." She stared at him. "As for the rest of it," he said, "I would like to propose something, and I ask that you hear it before you respond." She heard it. She sat in the chair across from her father's desk, across from Calder Ashworth, Duke of Ashworth, who had bought her home without knowing it was her home, and she listened. He was not a romantic man. He did not speak like one. What he proposed was orderly and clearly considered, a legal arrangement. She would continue to manage the household formally, with a proper contract and a proper wage. He would consult her on any changes to the property, and no changes would be made without her agreement. In 5 years, if she wished, she could purchase back a portion of the estate, the house and the home farm, at the price he had paid for it, which he named, which was fair. "You've thought about this," she said. "I think about most things," he said. "Since when?" A pause. "Since Agnes told me, on my second day here, that the new housekeeper knew where everything was without being shown, and that she sometimes stood in front of the old portraits in the long gallery and looked at them for a long time." Imogen closed her eyes briefly. Agnes and her river of talk. "I knew you weren't who you said you were," he said. "I did not know who you were, but I noticed, and I thought it worth waiting to understand before acting." She looked at him. He was hard to read, she thought, not because he concealed things exactly, but because he was very precise. He said what he meant and nothing more, and she had been raised among men who said everything except what they meant, and the difference was disorienting. "Why?" she said. "Because." He stopped, started again. "Because this is clearly your home. That was apparent within days. And I am a man who has owned many properties, Miss Weston, and I have never owned a place that was someone's home in the way this is yours. I found it instructive to observe." She thought about that. "And what did you conclude?" He looked at the window. A long pause. "That I have purchased a great deal of property in my life and felt very little about any of it, and that, perhaps that should have troubled me sooner than it did." The fire settled. Somewhere below, in the kitchen, someone was starting dinner. She could smell it faintly, rosemary, onion, the kitchen smells she had grown up with. "I need time to consider," she said. "Of course," he said. She stood. He stood. She walked to the door, and then she stopped, because there was something she needed to ask. "The portraits in the long gallery," she said. "You won't remove them?" It was not quite a question. He looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "They stay." She did not give him an answer that night, or the next day, or for 3 days after that. She walked the property in the early mornings, when the Duke was in the study with Mr. Felton and the house was quiet. She walked the walled garden and the orchard and the lane down to the home farm where the tenant Mr. Garvey had been farming the same 40 acres since before she was born, and who took one look at her the second morning and said, "Miss Imogen, didn't expect to see you." "I'm working here," she said. "Ah," said Mr. Garvey, who had always been a man of few supplementary words. "Good." She walked the graveyard at the village church, where her mother was buried. She sat on the stone bench that was cold now with late autumn, and she thought about what it meant to belong somewhere, and what it meant to own somewhere, and whether those were the same thing or very different things pretending to be the same. She thought about the Duke. He was not what she had expected, which was perhaps her own fault for expecting anything. He was thorough. That was the word she kept returning to. He did not make assumptions. He asked when he wanted to know something. He read the same letter twice before responding. He walked the estate at dusk, not briskly, the way men walked when they wanted to be seen walking, but slowly, the way people walk when they are actually looking. He had known for weeks that she was lying to him, and he had waited. He had waited to understand. She thought about that more than she wanted to. On the fourth day, she went to the study and knocked. "I have one condition," she said. He looked up from the desk. "One, the East Library. It stays as it is. The books, the arrangement, the writing desk. Nothing moves. Nothing is sold or lent or removed. When I am no longer here, if I am no longer here, it goes to whatever comes next, as it is, because of your mother's books," he said. Not a question, she had not told him that. She looked at him. "The ledger," he said, "the handwriting. It was a woman's, and it was old enough to be." He paused. "I made an inference." She swallowed. "Yes, because of my mother's books," agreed, he said. "Is that your only condition? Yes?" He nodded. He reached for a pen. "Then I'll have Mr. Felton draw up the contract." She turned to leave. "Miss Weston," she stopped. "The housekeeper position," he said, "is yours as long as you want it, not because of the arrangement. Separately, you are good at it, and the household has been considerably more functional since your arrival, and I—" A pause, the precise man choosing his words precisely. "I have found your presence here to be not unwelcome." She thought that might have been, for Calder Ashworth, a fairly significant admission. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. She walked out into the corridor and stood for a moment with her back against the wall, looking at the ceiling. Then she walked down to the East Library, sat in the window seat, and looked out at the kitchen garden and the elm and the sky going gray over the Somerset hills. And for the first time since Tuesday, since that particular Tuesday in October with the solicitor and the broken wax seal and the street traffic that did not stop, she felt something ease, not restored, not what it had been, something harder and stranger than that, the beginning of what it might become. Mr. Forsyth did not give up cleanly. Men of his kind rarely did. In January, he sent a second letter through a different solicitor, asserting that the Duke had an obligation to disclose any known deception on the part of estate employees, and that his failure to do so constituted a form of. The legal language wound through 3 paragraphs before arriving at nothing specific, which Imogen read as a sign that even Forsyth's solicitor found the argument thin. The Duke wrote back a single paragraph. He let her read it before he sent it. It was the most efficiently dismissive thing she had ever seen committed to paper. She told him so. "I had a good education," he said. "In writing letters of dismissal? In clarity," he said. "My father believed in it," he said. He stopped, started again. He said most suffering in the world comes from people failing to say plainly what they mean. She thought about that. He sounds like he was a difficult man to argue with. "He was," he said, and something moved briefly in his face. Not quite a smile. Almost. She had been learning his face over these months. It was not an expressive face, in the conventional sense. But there were things that moved across it. Small, careful things, and she had found herself, without quite deciding to, cataloging them. The way he frowned slightly when he was reading something that interested him. The stillness that settled over him at dusk, when he stood at the study window looking out at the grounds. The fact that he took his coffee without sugar, but would take a biscuit if one was offered without his asking for it. She was not, she told herself, doing what it felt like she might be doing. February, a hard frost. The kind that turned the kitchen garden silver overnight and made the old cedars creak. She was lighting the fire in the library when he appeared in the doorway, which had become, without being discussed, a kind of habit. He used the library in the mornings, she used it in the evenings, and occasionally the edges of those times overlapped. "I've been looking at the Somerset land records," he said. "I'd like your opinion on something." "My opinion," she said. "You grew up here. You know the land." He held up a map, an old survey, hand-drawn, the kind she recognized from the estate papers her father had kept. "The boundary here at the north corner. The hedge line doesn't match what's on the current deed." She came and looked. She knew immediately what he was referring to. A strip of meadow that had always been called, informally, the Miller's Field, because a man named Miller had grazed sheep on it 50 years ago. Her father had never been certain of its status. He had meant to look into it. He had meant to do a great many things. "It was disputed," she said, "between this estate and the neighboring farm. There were letters. They should be in the estate archive, in the box on the second shelf, the brown one." He looked at her. "I used to read the archive," she said. "When I was young, I found the letters interesting. You read the estate archive." "I was a curious child," she said. "The house was quiet after my mother died, and I ran out of novels." He looked at her for a moment, then, and she would remember this moment later, turning it over like a stone to see what was underneath. He laughed. Not loudly, barely more than an exhale, but it was real and it reached his eyes, and it was the first time she had heard it in 4 months. "The brown box," he said. "Second shelf." "Yes," she said, and went back to the fire which was beginning to catch. By March she had stopped pretending, to herself, that what she felt when she heard him on the stairs in the morning was nothing. She was practical. She had always been practical. She knew the shape of things clearly enough to see it. She was a woman of 23 who had lost her home and come back for it, and found, in the process, a man she had not expected, and she had somehow, without any plan, without any intention, she had come to notice his particular quality of stillness, and his precision, and the fact that he said what he meant and no more, and she thought about his face more than was sensible. She was, in other words, in a great deal of trouble. She told herself it would pass. She told herself it was the situation, the strangeness of it, the intimacy of it. 2 people managing the same house in a winter that had not quite ended. She told herself a number of useful things. Then, on an evening in late March, she was in the library. She had a book. She was not reading it. The fire was low. Outside, the first daffodils had come up along the south wall, which she could not see but knew, because she had watched them come up in the same place every March of her life. The Duke came in. He did not say anything for a moment. He went to the window. "Forsyth has withdrawn," he said. "The solicitor sent word this morning. He's found another target, apparently." "Good," she said. A silence. The fire. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the arrangement." Something tightened in her chest. "The 5-year contract." Yes, he was still looking at the window. "I want to revise it." Here it was, then. She had wondered. She put the book down. "In what way?" He turned. And the thing about Calder Ashworth she had learned was that when he looked at you completely. Not past you, not around you, at you. It was the most undivided attention she had encountered in her life, and it was entirely unfair. "I want to remove the 5-year provision," he said. "For a purchase. I would like to. I think it would be better if the arrangement were." He stopped, started again. "I want to propose a different arrangement." She waited. "I am aware," he said carefully, "that this is not straightforward. You came here under circumstances that were, You did not choose them freely, and I would not want you to feel another stop. I am trying to say this plainly. Please, she said. He looked at her. I don't want to sell this house, he said. Not even to you. I find that I have somewhat unexpectedly come to want what you apparently want, which is to stay here, and I would like, if you are willing, to stay here together, properly. If that is, he exhaled. I am asking you to marry me, Miss Weston. I'm asking badly, I realize. She looked at him. I know this house is yours, he said. I knew it months ago. I have thought about this for some time, and I want you to know that I'm not asking for the house's sake or for the arrangement's sake. I am asking because the thought of any other arrangement, any arrangement in which you are not here, is something I find I am simply unable to. He stopped. I find I am unable to accept it. That is plain enough, I think. It was, Imogen thought. For a man who said what he meant and no more, it was quite plain indeed. Calder, she said. He looked at her. She had never said his name before. She had thought it, in the small hours when honesty was easier. She had never said it. I want to stay, she said. I have wanted to stay here my entire life. I came back to stay, and she thought about February, and his laugh, and the map of the miller's field, and the brown box on the second shelf, and all the quiet mornings. I find I no longer want to stay for the reason I came. That has changed, considerably. He was across the room before she had quite finished the sentence, which surprised her, because he was not a man who moved quickly, generally. He was usually very deliberate. He took her hand, just her hand, nothing more. He looked at her. Yes, she said. Outside, beyond the window she could not see, from where she stood, the daffodils were up along the south wall, the same as always, the same as every March she could remember, all the way back to the beginning. She had come home for the house. She stayed for something that had no name yet, but would, in time, fill every room of it.